Hello, friends, and welcome to yet another episode of Impact Everywhere. It is the podcast where I try to find positive impact in unexpected places and share them with you. This week, we have Nora Rahimian, who is a creative consultant that has been helping artists and musicians from all over the world have a greater impact using art as a tool for change. And she's been doing this work for over a decade. I met Nora through a weird change of introductions after hanging out at South by Southwest, and she came super highly recommended as someone I should speak to if I was trying to figure out how to become a more effective activist. And so I reached out to her, invited her onto this podcast, and asked if she could share the different tools, strategies, and methodologies that she advises to her artists and to the brands that they support on how they can become more effective in the work that they do, how they might measure impact, and when you know if you're doing enough. This is Nora Rahimian, and here she is talking about life before becoming a creative consultant.
I started off doing community organizing, and so my earliest kind of abolition and gang intervention peace building work was through the nonprofit world. And long story, ended up in Liberia and saw very clearly how the nonprofit industrial complex benefited from the oppressions that it claimed to fight. And it wasn't effective. We were trying to do this like one-to-one work, and it was slow and it was tedious. And then I met some rappers who got on stage in front of 300 people and said, hey, here's how you all should behave. And then they did it. And so when I saw how audiences reacted to artists and to creatives in a way that they weren't reacting to NGOs or social workers or community organizers, I realized that the change can happen quicker, but also that the change kind of takes root more deeply. And so it took me a while to realize that that's what it was. For me, this is where my work happens, is because art and culture provides the emotional connection that then gets people to change. I can give you facts all day and you'll just resist it, or you'll deny it, or you'll make up your own facts. Versus when somebody has an emotional response to something, that's where the opening happens to shift beliefs and shift values and shift behaviors. And so once I saw that in action, I was like, oh, this is it. Like, the work that we do is more emotional than we admit it to be.
Let's go a little deeper there, because I'd love for you to expand upon what exactly was the work that the nonprofit was doing. What was it trying to accomplish, and why it was inefficient, so that we can actually contrast that against the emotional response that was triggered through the work of the artists.
So let me not say it was inefficient. I started off my first kind of official job, organizing work. I ran programs for a local community organization that did gang intervention work. And what we did was work with young people who were at different parts of the criminal and justice system and provide them with wraparound services. So helping them earn money so that they could pay restitution, or helping them get the community support that they needed so that they didn't violate the terms of their probation and get reincarcerated. This was in Santa Cruz County, which has some pretty good restorative justice practices around decarceration and things like that. So the work was effective, but it was one by one. It was very individual, and it wasn't addressing systemic change at a rate that systemic change needed to happen. So I could help one young person, but it was slow and it was tedious. And what I saw as I started to do more national work and more international work was how much the systems of nonprofit world were designed to just maintain the systems of nonprofit world. We couldn't get funding because we didn't have a certain degree of education, for example, or people who had kind of celebrity status were getting more funding, even though no one was looking at the outcomes of their work. And so for me, the shift was kind of the decentralization that artists could do. Artists have a direct relationship with their audience. There's already a built-in trust and a little bit of an aspirational value, right? You want to be like your favorite artist. You want to be like your favorite celebrity. And we already see that being exploited to sell products, to sell Jordans or Yeezys or whatever. We can take that same kind of process and sell action or sell values or sell other things. And so that for me felt much more genuine and took away a lot of the bureaucracy and stuff that happens in the nonprofit world.
That's wonderful. So tell me about this collaboration that you did in Liberia with these rappers. What were they trying to fight against, and what were the mechanics of seeing change happen? How do you even measure the outcome of collaboration with rappers for culture change?
So I worked in particular with one artist named Takun J. And by the time I met him, had already been arrested by the government for making music about corruption in the police department. And not only had they gone after him, but they were going after other rappers because they might also make that kind of music. There was a very fearful response at the time. And so what I saw in Takun was that young people, especially, the first time I saw him perform, he said, shh, and 300 people just went dead silent. And he said, jump, and they jumped. They had a relationship with him already that was built on trust and affinity and all these things. And so we partnered with an organization that was doing work around gender-based violence. And we created some songs, but it's not songs that were like preachy, right? This wasn't PSA type music. They were club bangers, and they were hits, and they were in the colloquial style that people were used to from him. And so they trusted the message that was coming from him organically. And we created some songs, and we created some music videos, and we would do like street jams and events. And every time he went on the radio, he would talk about these things. And what happened was, in addition with the songs, he as the artist started giving young people language to use around this specific issue. A couple of things happened that were really interesting. One was that young women started showing up he had like a little community center club, and young women started showing up to report their cases of sexual assault to him. And in a culture where the stigma is high and people notoriously underreport, they were coming to tell us their experiences. And so that breaking of silence was really important. And the other thing was that we'd start to hear, just kind of like out in the street or whatever, young people would quote him to each other. Hey, don't you know Takun J says don't do that? Or, oh, don't you know Takun J says da 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 da. And so it started to create this cultural shift where the conversation started to change because he made it okay to have those conversations, and he provided the language through which to do it. And that was like maybe like 8 years ago or something like that. And still those conversations are happening, and the songs are still on the radio. And it changed his relationship with the government. The same government that was trying to come after him and arrest him and jail him ended up making him an ambassador for the Ministry of Gender because of the work and how effective it was. And so in that sense, his audience ended up protecting him in the same way that he was looking out for his audience.
All right, guys, I'm hitting pause on the podcast here for a second. How cool is it that a song manages to shift the language that people use so that they can have conversations that they wouldn't have otherwise? I figured you guys might be really curious to hear more about what the song sounded like. So I dug it out online. This is Justice by Takun J. That's Takun J. Check it out in full after this podcast.
So where is the justice? They say justice for all and justice for everybody. But once you got no money and your justice gonna be very just a lie to us.
See the man over there, see the lady over there. She's fighting for her rights, he's crying for his rights. Justice, justice, justice.
Mama, eh, mama, eh, mama, eh.
Justice for the poor, justice for the streets, justice for the who. Everybody put your hands up, say justice, justice, justice.
But I don't know.
Wow, what an amazing story. I love it. I'm curious, so is this something that works across all nationalities? Does it work better in developing countries? Does it work also in more, let's say, saturated markets like in the Americas? And if so, how might an emerging artist who is maybe less established, what lessons can they learn from this, and how can they bring ideas and strategies into their own framework?
I think it applies for everyone. And we're talking about artists as an example, but this model of you are someone that has influence, and you don't have to be an influencer to be influential, right? Everyone has a sphere of influence. To say, look, I have a platform and this is how I choose to use my platform. Anybody can do that, no matter if you're an artist or a celebrity or a writer or blogger or whatever. And I think part of what makes it work is that you're not trying to talk to everyone. You're trying to talk to your unique audience. And so that's part of what makes it so impactful, is that you're speaking in a language that audience is used to being in conversation with you. One of my favorite examples is Little B the Bass God, who's a rapper, who a little while ago was on Twitter talking about consent and saying things like, hey, if anyone in my circle doesn't respect women, I'm going to kick you out of my circle. This wasn't like a crazy thought out strategy. This wasn't a plan. This was just him making a clear statement of his values to his audience. And so something as simple like that can be really impactful. think for artists who are like just starting out, there's a sense of like, this is risky. If I make a stand or I say something, I might alienate my audience. But what you actually end up doing is showing that you stand for something. You stand for something that your fans are affected by. So you're actually looking out for them. And it makes people buy into you more. And that's a change I've seen in the last 5 to 10 years. Is initially, I think artists were very afraid to speak up. And now they're understanding that if they don't speak up, that's probably more detrimental to them. And so that kind of silence as complicitness, audiences don't tolerate that anymore, whether it's music or any other genre.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think there's a rise of the activist artist is definitely something that we see trending across the board, even within companies, corporate environments, as well as independents. So then I guess the question is, how do you tell if someone's an authentic activist versus like someone just doing it because it's the trendy thing to do of the moment, especially now with the Black Lives Matter movement?
Right. So it's two core things, I would say. One is looking at the actions that back up the language. So it's really easy to say we stand with Black lives. Great, lovely. Let me see what your staff looks like. Let me see how you're paying people. Let me see what your supply chain is. Like, what are the actions that you're doing that back this? And is it institutionalized within the system, or are these kind of like superficial performances that you're putting on? And so really looking at action is one. And the other thing is the action that you're taking and the words that you're saying, are you taking a risk that's proportional to the privilege that you have? And so for someone who's sitting at home, isn't a big corporation, maybe for them, posting on social media is a big risk. Having those conversations with their family members is a big risk, and that counts. But for a big corporation to just post on Instagram, that doesn't count, right? For me, it's measured by the kind of risk that you're taking, because that's where change happens. I think this is why risk is important, is that power doesn't give anything up without struggle and pressure against that power. And so for people who do have power, who do have privilege, who do have access to resources and capital and things like that, you have to be willing to put those things on the line to push back against the power that we're trying to shift. Otherwise, you're protecting what you have. You're protecting the power that we're trying to challenge. But then speaking against it, it's a little hypocritical. If I could break it down the most simply, it's about taking a risk that's proportional to everything that you have, and then putting the actual work that matches whatever rhetoric you're repeating.
Can you give me an example of what a risk would be for a major brand or a major company that you've seen versus one that is not risky enough?
So one of the things we saw a couple weeks ago on like Blackout Tuesday was all the record labels put out all these signs of support. Great, but their artists still don't own their masters. Artists still aren't getting paid fairly. And so what that is it looks good for the labels, but they're not actually risking anything. They're not losing any money. They're not redistributing power. Another example we see really commonly is people who are like, we'll do a concert for a good cause, but that concert is really just good PR for you. You're not risking anything. You're not doing anything different than how you have been doing it. And so those are all performances where nothing is being risked. One of my favorite examples of a company that has consistently done it right is Ben & Jerry's, where they have a history of talking about social issues. They've gotten a ton of pushback, and the values that they talk about are integrated throughout their system. So everything from employees getting paid fairly to their suppliers being treated right to how they hire. And so it's not that they're jumping on the bandwagon. It's not something that they're just doing for good PR and good relations. They're actively taking a stance and saying unapologetically, Black Lives Matter and all these other things. And so that's one of the biggest kind of, if you want to compare and contrast, how the record label and the music industry has dealt with this versus how a company like Ben & Jerry's has been dealing with it for years and years.
Another pause in the podcast here, because as a vegan, I didn't actually know what kind of activism Ben & Jerry's was involved in. So I did a little bit of digging online, and I dug out this amazing little clip from over 2 years ago where Matthew McCarthy, the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, was speaking on CNBC News, talking about the values, the risks that they were taking. Just to give you guys an idea of what corporate social activism actually looks like, which is actually a topic that we talked about in episode 2 of our podcast with Joshua Bellhumor, for those of you who are a little bit more curious. Anyways, this is Matthew McCarthy from Ben & Jerry's.
So I get the privilege of leading a team and a business that has a 4-decade track record of not only making the best ice cream in the world, but actually putting its money where its mouth is in terms of driving progressive change. And these stem from environmental justice, social justice, Black Lives Matter, and really going after systemic racism in ways that, frankly, I think business does have a role.
Are you worried about losing conservative consumers? I mean, it's a pretty liberal agenda you've got there.
Well, I think that not everybody may agree with our position and the position the team and I have. And that's actually something where it gets me excited because I want to create more dialogue. This is not about one side fighting another on issues. But I think never before have we had a lot of issues bubbling to the surface in the United States, where I think we need to come together as people. We need to come together around these issues and have more dialogue.
How cool is that, guys? I kind of wish I was eating ice cream so that I could go and support the work that they're doing. Anyways, back to our conversation. This is Past Ben asking Nora the next question on the list. For people who are maybe just touching upon the idea of privilege for the first time and want to get involved, but it's like super intimidating because it's so easy to say the wrong thing, how do you recommend people kind of start confronting their own privilege or their own power or ability to do something?
I mean, it's uninviting and it's uncomfortable, but that's part of it, right? Part of the process is sitting with the fact that you're going to say things and people are going to get upset with you, and sitting with those feelings and what does it mean? Because that's what it feels like to not be in a position of privilege all the time. That's the feeling that people of color, that women, that trans folks have been living in for so long, always walking on eggshells around how do I code switch so that this person receives me well. And so that feeling is actually part of the process. And so I think a lot of people want to intellectually understand the issues that we're talking about, which is great and really important. But this emotional component is also necessary. And so when that discomfort comes up, to explore it and sit with it and feel it, because that's a necessary part of the change. And then it's things like reading and asking questions and having conversations, really taking the responsibility on yourself to educate yourself rather than asking people to break it down for you really simply. Honestly, these are conversations that a lot of people have been having for a long time. And so for people who are showing up now, there's a little bit of like, we've been in class this whole time. You've been sleeping and now you're late. I'm not going to give you all my notes because I'm tired and I've done all the work. So you have to put in a little bit of work, and maybe you're tired and maybe that's exhausting, but that's how the rest of us have been feeling. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. Activists who are new, we welcome you. We need you. Like, thank you. And also there's a ton of work that people have done beforehand. And so your comfort doesn't take precedent over that.
Yeah, no, I hear you loud and clear. This combination of discomfort and listening is definitely a really powerful combination that we should all kind of take part in. I feel like I meet people all the time who would like to do more good in the world, but don't really know how they fit in. How do you actually make a career out of, standing up for something? What does that look like? And how do you even like operationalize it? Does it just come from speaking your truth and finding your tribe, or is it more sophisticated than that?
Can I say something first about like people who want to do good? Because I think we're in a moment now where good only counts if it lends itself to social media easily. And I've been having a lot of conversations with people who've been doing this work forever and feel like, oh, well, it's not enough because I'm not posting about it. I'm not talking about it. And that pressure of it doesn't count unless there's photos is crazy. Like, this has never existed before in the history of activism. And so I think it's important to say it counts, even if I don't see it, but you're doing it. It counts if it doesn't lend itself to a cute hashtag. Like, it's the action that matters, not the documentation so much. And so I think we've gotten a little confused lately where people are more focused on the photo op than about the impact. And so even the little things, right? The spending your money with a Black-owned business instead of going to Amazon, the showing up at a protest, the having the difficult conversations, like those tiny things count and add up and matter. And sometimes those interpersonal moments have more impact. So I just want to point that out. It doesn't have to be all over social media. It doesn't have to be like a huge thing for your activism to be impactful.
I love that you say that impact doesn't have to be flashy. Like impact isn't just about how you can show off to others and be the center of attention, be the hero in that journey. It's not really about that. It's more about doing the right thing. I'm actually curious what your definition of impact actually is. What does it mean to you? Because that's something that means a lot of different things to many different people.
It's about the change. What has changed as a result of your intervention? It's really that simple. Are we a step closer to freedom? Are we a step closer to abolition? Are we a step closer to understanding and compassion? And so if there has been a change as a result of your action and intervention, then that's active.
And how do you know when you're doing enough if all you're expecting is one step closer?
When we think about revolution and social change, we think about it as like one big explosion. What it really is, though, is a series of small, gradual mutations that lead to evolution over time, right? To use that metaphor. And so you do one action and then you do another and then you do another. And it's the series of tiny, small actions that add up. And you look back and you're like, oh shit, I've done all this work. And then if each of us look back and have a whole trail of work that we've done, then that's how we shift culture. And so you do work for as long as you have the energy and the resources to do it. And that's going back to you do as much as you have power, privilege, and resources to do. And so it's not enough to just say, okay, I had my one conversation today, check. Have all the conversations, use all the things that are available to you, but you keep doing it until you can't.
I think we maybe live in a world where you're either an activist or you're not. At least that's the way social media tends to portray things. And so there's always a sense that, you're supposed to be more, but actually being an activist and always fighting becomes really, really tiring. And I think it's easy for people to burn out when they focus on how much is left to do rather than all the progress that has been made or all the things that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't been involved in the first place. And sometimes it's a more positive way to look at it.
It's also the separation of like our personal from our political, from our professional is a capitalistic construct that we're these like separate beings. And so what I do, okay, now I'm going to be political and be an activist. All right, done. Now I'm going to go like be myself. All right, done. That's actually not how we are as human beings. And so to separate those things, this compartmentalization that we're seeing is part of, I think, the social media age that says, show me your activism, show me your professional life, all right, now, versus we're all holistic. And so this idea of activists as a profession is a fairly modern thing, right? The freedom riders, the Panthers, that wasn't their job. They had jobs. They were students who also happened to be activists, right? Who also happened to organize. And so I think that's also a new thing that we're seeing as social movements become co-opted and people throw money behind it because they want to control the direction of activism. And so it doesn't have to be a job. I think all of us have opportunities to integrate our values into our everyday lives. And so it's things like, whatever your job is, are you speaking up and advocating for the women of color that you work for? It's, are you being transparent about how much you make so that others can also negotiate better on their own behalf? Are you making sure that there's gender equity? Are you making sure that whatever panel you're on has diversity? Are you paying your workers fair? Are you supporting and uplifting narratives that are representative of everyone? Physically, is the venue that you're using, does it have disability access? Are you talking about consent? It's like all those kinds of things that you can incorporate into your daily life. It's all those tiny decisions that we can all make throughout the day that allow you to practice your politics in a way that has impact on a day-to-day ongoing basis, where it doesn't have to be these like big performances or things like that.
I love how accessible change feels when you speak about it that way, because it really is about those micro decisions, right? And they all add up, because a lifetime of micro decisions makes a world of difference. So I think that's really cool. You've mentioned a number of times now that activism has changed over the last couple years. Why don't you tell me how activism used to be, maybe during like civil rights movements versus where we are today, and what the trade-offs have been for both?
When we talk about the Panthers, for example, or we talk about the Freedom Riders, for example, Their work was grounded in civic education. They were learning about global politics. They were learning about what was happening elsewhere. They were learning about ideological perspectives. And then they were training in how do you show up and have a protest. So there was a degree of preparedness that existed back then that we're not so much seeing now, where a bunch of people just gather. I think there's also the understanding that this is over time. And one of the things that we see now with performative activism is that, all right, I performed, it's an action, that photo exists forever, or that video exists forever. And then what? Right? Which is part of my issue with like one day kind of blackouts. Okay, I don't shop today, but then I make up for everything tomorrow. What we're seeing is the kind of quick culture that we're used to, and the externally focused culture. How are people going to perceive me rather than what's the impact that I'm having? That's shifted. I think we can talk about why it's shifted, and it's not just social media's fault. I think part of that is the lives that people are living. People have student loans to pay off. There's an economic difference now and then that enabled activism to happen in the way that it did. But I think the work that was happening back then was grounded in understanding that this wasn't just this action alone in an isolated context, but that it was existing in other things. And my hope is that as people work off this first phase of what's going on now in this moment, that will expand to allow for those greater things to step in.
I guess the positive is that because there have been so many organizations that have been working on so many of these issues for so long, what this has effectively done is given them a lot of momentum and wind under their sails to actually push for the change that they're ready for. I was having a conversation with John Hocevar, the director of Greenpeace, in episode 13, and he was saying that hobby activism actually really has a place when it's associated to like an organization or a movement that has the power to leverage that. So while it may, well, you called it performative activism, while it may be like a negative thing on the forefront, it still can be leveraged for good when it happens in these big enough waves at one time. And so now more than ever before is a time to capitalize on it. I guess there's some really big hope there. What advice would you give to someone who wants to do more, doesn't know where to start? Maybe racism isn't the cause that really speaks to them, but they'd like to tackle some other things. Do you have any advice on how to discover your own personal calling or personal cause that you want to adopt and really dive deeper into?
I mean, I believe really strongly that none of us are free until we're all free. So we can end racism, but as long as there's like homophobia, we're still not free, right? Or whatever those things are. Start with whatever speaks to you. Like, we all have something that we're struggling with, whether it's mental health or environment or animal rights. Like, just start with the thing that speaks with you. And I would invite you to explore how that connects to some of these other conversations that people are having, right? But as we start, so I want to answer your question thoughtfully. Yeah, I mean, start with the thing that speaks with you, speaks to you, and then investigate it and explore it. And really read about intersectionality. I think that's a word that gets thrown around and people are maybe embarrassed to be like, what does that really mean? And so maybe that's the place that you do research, and that's the place that you start to explore. Part of this like culture that we're in now, where we're quick to shame and we're quick to cancel. We don't give people permission to make mistakes as they're learning. Find the places where you can ask the questions, where you can explore the things that you need to explore, and understand that it's going to be messy because these are uncomfortable conversations that we're having, which also means listen to folks who are experts in their own world.
When you were going on to give an example of different intersectionalities before you cut yourself off, like, why don't you give, give it, like, expand upon that, like how following, so maybe someone who cares about animals, for example, might be like, oh, well, but animals aren't really the most effective way of combating anything, really. But like, I think when you present that all these issues are interconnected, that it really doesn't matter where you start as long as you fucking start. I think that's just such a powerful arc to take people on.
Actually, a really good example is the way pre-COVID, we had all these ideas about what working had to look like. And a lot of disability activists have advocated for, we need to work from home, we need to change these structures. And we're told, what? No, you have to be in an office, you have to work a 9 to 5, because that's what capitalism tells us work looks like. And then here comes COVID. And now all of a sudden, all these things that we thought were impossible are possible, right? And so disability activism has actually opened up the way and made a lot of these things that we're doing possible. And now what we're starting to see is that so much of what we thought was impossible is possible now. And so that's setting up the groundwork for this moment around abolishing the police, which we thought was impossible, is now possible. And so as you trace it, you start to see how all these movements are connected, and the work that we do in one area relates to the work that we do in the other.
That's a great example. I love it. It's really interesting to hear how, we often get caught up in saying like, oh, I as an individual haven't managed to do very much or something like that. But we forget that so much of what happens is standing on the shoulders of giants. They're a result of so many people standing up for so long, fighting for the things that they believe in. And that we also have to start and play our part so that the next generations can also benefit from the work that we're doing here, even if it feels ineffective or even if it feels insubstantial at this point in time. I want to go back to the arts really quickly because, I'm an artist and I have this kind of problem where I think that it's so hard to sell the impact of art. If you can't measure the impact of art, then you can't really sell the impact of art. And if you can't sell it, then you can't really hire people to do it. You can't create job opportunities for it. So do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to start unlocking the creative potential of culture to come in and do more than just sell product? How can we create more business opportunities for the advocates and those who are lending their voice to these really important issues? And sometimes it's actually dangerous for them, right? Like they're creating problems for themselves, especially in like emerging nations. And there's a risk that you take when you decide to be on the spectrum of activism. And so how can we create more opportunities for people like that?
The idea of measuring impact, cause and effect one-to-one. I put in work, I want to see the results. Like that direct, kind of very linear way of thinking isn't actually how progress works, right? And I'll give you an example. When I used to do gang intervention work, donors wanted to see, well, like, how do I know that this has stopped someone from being in a gang? And I was like, honestly, I don't know. I can't give you a before and after survey of like how likely I am to commit violence now and how likely I am after, like, it doesn't work that way. But I can tell you if one of my students decides to fist fight you rather than pull out a gun, that's progress because that's a shift in the decisions that he's making around his behavior. But it's these like little anecdotal things. And I think there's value in the anecdotes, and art is like that. Why do we listen to songs when we break up with someone? Because there's emotionally a connection that we're feeling. That's impact. Or why do we watch movies and cry? Because that's impact. Or we want comedies to make us forget. Like all of those things are impact. But because there's no quantitative measure of it, it doesn't count. But anyone can tell you that they've experienced art and had an emotional reaction to it. Those subtle things actually are the things that take root more deeply and then open up the space for change to happen. Part of what makes art work is that when you watch a commercial, you know that someone's trying to sell something to you. So already your brain is like, oh, you're trying to sell to me, right? There's already that guardedness. When you're experiencing art, you're expecting truth and honesty and vulnerability. And so you're already more receptive for anything that might come out of that space. And that has to do with how we think of art as a medium, but also the relationship that audience has with artists. Culturally, we expect artists to be truth tellers and Imagineers and like all that kind of stuff. And so we're much less guarded and much more open to receiving whatever message an artist has to tell us. And I think that's part of what makes them so effective in bringing up these conversations and shifting culture and all these things.
When you start coaching all the different artists that you represent and they're trying to ultimately also make a living out of this, how does all this authenticity play into, let's say, building up a brand deal? Or how do you like bring components of activism into the workplace? Because it's something that so many companies are actually scared of touching and don't necessarily see value in it. They just see risk, and companies don't like risk.
It's that value statement that you make by standing up for something or doing something. That's the thing that lets your audience know how you're different from everyone else. It's saying that I understand that my power as a company or as an artist comes from the fact that I have you as a customer. And so if you're being impacted by something, I don't want to lose you. And I want to show you that I care about you as a customer. And so I will speak on and act on the things that you're impacted by. It feels risky, but it's actually the thing that sets you apart from other brands, that sets you apart from other artists when you speak up and you show it's part of your brand personality. You might lose a couple customers, but you gain much more loyal customers. And we see this with the example of Ben and Jerry's, where, yeah, a couple conservative people got really upset and don't buy Ben and Jerry's anymore. But think about all the people who specifically now are getting Ben and Jerry's because Ben and Jerry's has made an unapologetic stance for these values that we all share. And so it actually brings in not just more business, but more loyal business. And so it sets you up as an artist or a brand or a company for longer term success.
So what I'm almost hearing you say is that if you're an artist or an individual working at a company, you would benefit from putting together some kind of a presentation showcasing and educating your client on why taking a stance is something that is really important right now. And it's actually a risk to not take a stance. All right, then last question. If you could ask every single person in the world to do one thing, one action, what would that action be?
Heal your traumas. Like, find the places where you're hurt and really love on that and heal on that, because otherwise we'll continue to pass on our hurt to other people. And so if I can invite folks to sit with the uncomfortable parts of themselves and like really love on themselves, then that will start to heal, I think, at a really core level, some of the things that we're all struggling with.
That's beautiful. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Nora. Where can people follow you? How should they keep in touch? Where should they reach out? Where should they go to stalk you?
At Nora Rahimian on everything, Twitter, Instagram. I answer all my DMs. So if you have questions, send those to me. Yeah, find me online. I like talking to people.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. That was amazing.
Thank you.
All right, folks, Nora Rahimian. Rahimian is Rahimian. For those of you who want to reach out, she is actually super friendly and honestly willing to help you with any questions that you have. So if you are an individual or a brand looking to figure out how to become more of an activist, don't hesitate to reach out and connect with her. If you guys are enjoying this week's podcast and looking for quotes to share or to remember, make sure to check out the Impact Everywhere blog on Medium. I think you can find it by just searching for it on Google. Send it to your friends, leave a rating, share the love. Every little bit counts. Next week, we have an amazing guest for you by the name of Blair Glencourse. Over the last 8 years, Blair began something called the Accountability Labs, which seeks to change the way that people are named and shamed into being named and famed. They go into countries with high levels of corruption and try to nominate individuals that are doing good within their communities and celebrate them so that people know who to look up to rather than to look down on. They do this a variety of different ways, including a show called Integrity Icon, once known as Integrity Idol, until they were threatened with a lawsuit by the one and only American Idol. Anyways, I can't wait to share it with you guys, and remember to stay positive because impact is everywhere.